In the summer of 1939, Europe stood on the edge of catastrophe. The Treaty of Versailles had left Germany humiliated 2 decades earlier, yet under Adolf Hitler's rule the nation had rearmed and grown increasingly aggressive. Austria had been annexed, Czechoslovakia dismantled, and by August of that year the focus shifted squarely to Poland. The world watched anxiously, aware that Hitler's ambitions did not stop at rhetoric. Yet despite the looming threat, many in Britain and France clung to the hope that deterrence and diplomacy might avert another global conflict. The political maneuvering reached a climax with the shocking Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed on August 23, 1939. This non-aggression agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union stunned the world. It was not merely a pact of neutrality, it carried within it a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. For Poland, sandwiched between these two powers, the document was nothing less than a death sentence. Few in Warsaw realized just how quickly events would unfold. On September 1, 1939, German forces launched their attack. The strategy was Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Armored divisions supported by dive bombers pierced Polish defenses, bypassing strongpoints, and sowing chaos. Civilians were caught in the maelstrom, cities bombed, and refugees choked the roads. The German Wehrmacht, modernized and battle-hardened, tore into Poland from the west, north, and south with relentless momentum. The speed and ferocity of the attack shocked even seasoned observers. At this moment in the story, let's pause to say, if you are fascinated by detailed, real-time accounts of the Second World War, make sure to subscribe to this channel, give a like, and share this documentary with others who value authentic history. These campaigns shape the world we live in, and understanding them is crucial. Despite the bravery of the Polish soldiers, their situation was dire. The Polish army still relied heavily on cavalry, outdated equipment, and fragmented defensive lines. They had mobilized millions, but many units lacked proper coordination, radios, or even adequate anti-tank weapons. German panzer divisions, supported by the Luftwaffe, smashed through these defenses with speed Poland had never faced before. By September 3, Britain and France declared war on Germany, fulfilling their guarantee to Poland. Yet, for all the grand declarations, no meaningful aid came. Instead, what is now known as the phony war began in the West. Polish forces were left largely alone to face the German onslaught. Warsaw braced for siege, commanders struggled to regroup, and across the countryside, Polish resistance hardened but grew increasingly desperate. The invasion was just beginning, but even at this early stage, the outcome seemed ominous. German momentum was unchecked, and Poland's allies stood idle. But in the east, another storm was gathering, one that would soon shatter any hope Poland still held. As German forces advanced deeper into Poland, the defenders still held on to a faint hope that their allies in the west might open a second front. Polish commanders understood the odds were against them, yet they believed if Britain and France launched an offensive into Germany, it could relieve pressure and allow Polish forces to regroup. This expectation, however, would soon be crushed by events far beyond their control. On September 17, 1939, while the Polish army was already battered and retreating toward the Romanian bridgehead for a last stand, a second hammer blow fell. The Soviet Union invaded from the east. Under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact secret protocol, the Red Army crossed the border with overwhelming force, nearly 500,000 troops, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of aircraft. For Poland, it was the final betrayal. The Soviet leadership justified their move by claiming they were protecting Ukrainians and Belarusians living in eastern Poland, portraying the invasion as a humanitarian mission. In reality, it was a cold calculation. With Poland already collapsing, Stalin seized his half of the agreed spoils. Cities like Lwów and Wilno suddenly found themselves under siege by a second occupier, and Polish defenders realized they were trapped in a pincer. The psychological effect was devastating. Soldiers who had fought bravely against the Wehrmacht now faced an impossible choice: surrender to the Germans, resist the Soviets, or attempt a desperate retreat into neutral territories like Romania and Hungary. Communication between units broke down entirely. The Polish government fled into exile, eventually regrouping in France and later London, determined to continue the fight abroad. For civilians, the Soviet entry marked the beginning of a brutal occupation. Families were torn apart as deportations to Siberia began, intellectuals were arrested, and thousands of prisoners of war were marched into captivity. The infamous Katyn massacre of 1940, where Soviet forces executed more than 20,000 Polish officers and intelligentsia, had its roots in this invasion. While it lay in the future, the seeds of that tragedy were sown in September 1939. Meanwhile, Germany and the Soviet Union coordinated movements to avoid accidental clashes. In late September, the two powers formalized their arrangement through the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty, redrawing Poland's map. The once proud republic, reborn in 1918 after more than a century of partitions, was carved up once again, erased from the map in just over a month. The invasion from both sides underscored a harsh reality: Poland had no chance of survival against two great powers striking simultaneously. Despite its courage, its position on the geopolitical chessboard was untenable. With Poland divided, the war in Europe entered a new phase. The Western Allies were now officially at war with Germany, yet their armies remained inactive along the Maginot Line. The stage was being set for the wider conflagration that would soon engulf the continent. By the second week of September 1939, German armored spearheads had already reached the outskirts of Warsaw. On September 8, the 1st Panzer Divisions encircled the Polish capital, cutting it off from the rest of the country. The city, home to more than 1 million people, suddenly became the center of the conflict. Polish commanders, despite the catastrophic situation, resolved to defend Warsaw at all costs. What followed was one of the earliest examples of urban warfare in World War II, a desperate, bloody struggle that would symbolize Poland's defiance. The defenders consisted of remnants of retreating divisions, police units, and civilian volunteers who joined the fight. With limited heavy equipment, outdated anti-aircraft guns, and dwindling ammunition, Warsaw's garrison faced an enemy with superior numbers, tanks, artillery, and near-total air dominance. Beginning on September 9, the Luftwaffe initiated relentless bombing raids, reducing entire districts to rubble. Civilian casualties mounted rapidly, and by mid-September, water, electricity, and food supplies became scarce. The city endured day after day of firestorms from the air and bombardment from German artillery. Yet Warsaw did not surrender immediately. Resistance was fierce, with Polish anti-aircraft units managing to down dozens of German aircraft. Barricades were built in the streets, and snipers harassed enemy patrols. The Polish leadership understood that every additional day of resistance carried symbolic value. Even as their government fled to Romania, the defenders of Warsaw hoped that prolonging the battle might encourage Britain and France to finally launch an offensive in the west. By September 15, German forces had tightened their grip, attempting repeated assaults. But the defenders held them back through sheer determination. However, the entry of Soviet forces on September 17 sealed Warsaw's fate. Any chance of relief from the east evaporated overnight. The Polish command faced the harsh reality: they were encircled by two invaders, with no hope of external rescue. On September 25, the Germans launched Black Monday, one of the heaviest aerial bombardments of the war up to that point. More than 1,000 aircraft participated, turning large parts of the city into smoldering ruins. Fires raged uncontrollably, hospitals overflowed, and civilians suffered without shelter or food. 2 days later, with no possibility of further resistance, Warsaw's defenders opened negotiations. On September 28, 1939, the Polish capital officially surrendered. The fall of Warsaw marked the symbolic end of organized Polish resistance. Yet it also demonstrated the extraordinary will of a nation unwilling to yield easily. The defense had lasted 3 grueling weeks against overwhelming odds, and its legacy would inspire underground movements throughout the war. With Warsaw's surrender on September 28, 1939, the fate of Poland as an independent state was sealed. Yet the story of the invasion did not conclude on the battlefield. What followed in the weeks after was the systematic division, occupation, and destruction of Poland's sovereignty by its two conquerors, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. This was not an improvised arrangement but a carefully planned outcome, stemming from the secret clauses of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed on August 23. That agreement had quietly mapped out Poland's dismemberment, and by late September, those plans became grim reality. On September 28, The very day Warsaw fell, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty. This agreement redrew the map once more, moving the dividing line slightly eastward to grant the Soviets control over Lithuania, while Germany secured a larger share of central Poland. The map of Europe was literally redrawn over the ruins of Polish cities. The two occupiers, though ideologically opposed, cooperated pragmatically in extinguishing Polish independence. In German-occupied Western Poland, the Nazis implemented policies of terror and annihilation almost immediately. Tens of thousands of Polish intellectuals, clergy, and community leaders were arrested or executed in operations such as intelligence action. The goal was clear: to decapitate Polish society and eliminate any possibility of organized resistance. Simultaneously, German authorities began mass expulsions of Poles from annexed territories, clearing space for ethnic Germans resettled from the Baltic and other regions. In parallel, Poland's Jewish population, the largest in Europe, was subjected to brutal persecution, ghettoization, and targeted violence, an ominous foreshadowing of the Holocaust that would soon engulf millions. In the East, the Soviet occupation followed a different but equally destructive pattern. Soviet authorities imposed communist structures, suppressed religious and cultural institutions, and deported hundreds of thousands of Poles to Siberia and Central Asia. Families were torn apart overnight as trains carried civilians, officers, and entire communities into the vast Soviet interior. In April 1940, the Soviets committed one of the most infamous atrocities of the war, the Katyn massacre, in which more than 20,000 Polish officers and elites were executed. For Poland, the Soviet occupation was no liberation, but another form of national suffocation. Although divided, Poland's people did not remain passive. Underground networks began to form almost immediately, laying the foundation for what would become the largest resistance movement in occupied Europe. Secret schools operated in basements, newspapers circulated illegally, and couriers risked their lives to maintain communication with the government-in-exile, which had fled first to France and later to London. The dual occupation, brutal in its own distinct ways, transformed Poland into a nation of silent but determined resistance. The partition of Poland in 1939 was more than the conquest of territory. It was a chilling demonstration of how two totalitarian regimes, sworn enemies in ideology, could collaborate when it suited their ambitions. For the Polish people, the months following September marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in their history, an era of division, repression, and survival under dual foreign domination. By October 1939, the military struggle in Poland had ended, but the consequences of the German-Soviet invasion were only beginning to unfold. The swift collapse of the Polish state sent shockwaves across Europe. France and Britain, bound by alliance to Poland, had declared war on Germany on September 3, yet their response on the Western Front was minimal. The so-called phony war highlighted how unprepared the Allies were to challenge German aggression directly. For Hitler, the conquest of Poland was not just a territorial gain but a demonstration that the Western powers lacked the will to confront him decisively. Poland itself was transformed into a laboratory of oppression. In the German-controlled areas, a systematic campaign of terror unfolded. The general government, established in October under Hans Frank, became the administrative heart of occupied Poland. It was here that the Nazi regime tested policies that would later be expanded across occupied Europe: racial segregation, forced labor, economic exploitation, and above all, the persecution of Jews. Ghettos in cities such as Warsaw, Krakow, and Lodz confined hundreds of thousands under inhuman conditions, setting the stage for mass deportations and extermination in the years to come. In the Soviet-controlled East, repression was equally severe but followed a different logic. Moscow sought to erase Polish national identity and integrate the region into the Soviet state. Schools, courts, and political institutions were rapidly Sovietized, while any perceived opposition was met with arrests and deportations. Between 1939 and 1941, more than 1 million Poles were forcibly displaced into the Soviet interior, where countless perished in harsh conditions. These deportations left deep scars, remembered by survivors long after the war. The invasion also reshaped the geopolitical map of Europe. Hitler's confidence soared after the rapid victory, and the Wehrmacht gained invaluable combat experience. German generals who had tested new doctrines in Poland now refined them for larger campaigns. For Stalin, the occupation provided both a buffer zone against Germany and access to vital territories, but it also brought the Soviet Union closer to confrontation with the Western powers. The uneasy partnership between Berlin and Moscow would last less than 2 years, ending in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa. Meanwhile, Poland's government in exile took shape. First in France, then in London after France's fall in 1940, Polish leaders sought to keep their nation's cause alive. Polish forces reformed abroad and fought valiantly alongside the Allies, in the skies during the Battle of Britain, on the seas with the Polish Navy, and on distant battlefields from North Africa to Italy. Despite the destruction of their homeland, Poles continued to contribute to the Allied war effort with determination and sacrifice. The German-Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939 was more than the beginning of World War II. It was a brutal lesson in the fragility of international guarantees, the ruthlessness of totalitarian ambition, and the resilience of a people forced into resistance and exile. For Poland, the events of September and October 1939 were not the end, but the beginning of a long and tragic struggle for survival, one that would last until the war's final days in 1945.